Was Afrobeats Worship. Bless the Lord. You're on 94.9. It is 16 minutes past 4. And we have Dr. Taz Walker on the line from Creation Ministries International. He's here to answer your questions. If you send any questions through to our text line, that's 0401 949 949. Just SMS them through and we can ask Dr. Taz. It can be anything to do with aliens or dinosaurs or creation or evolution. And, of course, we talk about news from the last week as well. So, yeah, send those questions through. Dr. Taz, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mick. It's nice to catch up with you again. Really good. And everything's good up here in Brisbane. How's everything down there at Newcastle? I guess you'll do a weather report soon.
Yeah, we're a little bit south of Newcastle, but, yeah, it's not too bad. We've had a little bit of rain, but I kind of like the rain. I'm a pluviophile.
Good on you.
Now, Dr. Taz, I noticed there was a news story this week, which was an interesting one. And I know it's one of those news stories that lots of people ask the question, well, you know, is evolution alive and well? It was a story about these guys in a part of Asia that spend their lives in the water, you know, fishing and just spend a lot of time in the water. And this particular story was talking about how they can stay underwater for ridiculous amounts of time and their DNA has changed and they've basically evolved into this new creature or new type of human. What have you got to say about that whole evolution theory there?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting article, and it's by somebody in Cambridge, I think. Some lady in Cambridge was doing some work and wrote a report about them. But it's sort of, in a way, it's not particularly out of the ordinary. People can, you know, with training and with practice, be able to do all sorts of things, including swimming underwater for long periods of time. And they talk about people going down to 200 feet or something like that, 120 meters, something like that, and which is quite incredible. And they said it's to do with an enlarged spleen, which is something that helps that. But, you know, people can adapt to all sorts of conditions, like, for example, people can adapt to climbing up tall mountains, whereas most people that just live like we do down near the coast and not particularly high, we're not ready for it. And I know that during the Olympic Games and that, when if they've had them in very high places, like up in the Andes Mountains up there, Quito, I think there was one, athletes had to go up to this high area for weeks and weeks to become acclimatized. And so with time, eventually people's bodies do adapt. And it's the same when you move into a new area. The weather's different and it's really, really hot compared to living somewhere where it's really, really cold. Your body does adapt, and it's one of the ways that we're designed to be able to adapt to different climates. And so being able to swim underwater, that could be one explanation for how it happens. And it's not really evolution. Even if there was a mutation that was involved that affected, you know, the tribe and it was passed on between one and the other, that's not the sort of thing that's going to change one type of animal into another. So it's not really evolution in what's needed to be able to change microbes into microbiologists and that sort of thing. But it's a very interesting article, and it made me look up to think, if they go down to those depths, are they going to have trouble decompressing when they come up? But evidently, you don't have a problem depending on how long you stay at those depths. And so if they're down at those really ridiculous depths of, amazing depths down there, they can stay down there for a couple of minutes and come up without any need to decompress. But if a scuba diver or someone stays down there for extended time, they have to come up and they have to have a sort of a break and pause to allow the gases that get dissolved in their blood to come out without causing, little bubbles, and which cause the bends. So it sounds like the people are very good at swimming. They very much like swimming, but it's not really going to change, evolve into something different. It looks like it's part of the way in which our bodies were designed at the beginning.
What's the difference between natural selection and evolution?
Yeah, well, sometimes natural selection is called evolution, or often it is. It's called evolution. And the idea is natural selection is that you might get certain animals, like some animals have very thick coats, like a dog that gets a thick coat of hair, and it survives much better in cold climate, and so it tends to the dogs that live in that cold climate all tend to have the thick fur, and similarly dogs that live in a very hot climate tend to have thin fur. So that's called natural selection, where the animals that survive are ones that are more suited to their environment to be able to pass on their genes to their offspring. So that's called natural selection. And we call it adaptation. They adapt because evolution, when they talk about evolution, it really means one kind of animal turning into another. So you have, say, a frog or a fish, which it gradually changes into something like a frog, an amphibian that comes out onto the ground, and then that amphibian changes into a reptile like a lizard, and so there's changes from one kind of a creature to another kind. That you don't see that happening. The changes which occur to natural selection are just minor changes. Longer legs, stronger limbs, longer fur. They're very minor changes compared to what is needed to change one kind of animal into another. So we definitely see natural selection. It is active, but you don't see the evidence for changing one kind into another, being able to produce new organs, new features on a creature, like being able to produce from scales, turning them into feathers, and from legs, turning them into wings. You don't see that happening.
So in the case of these particular guys who can dive to incredible depths, it was talking about spleens, and in that story it actually said, people with larger spleens find it easier to do that. So, it's a given that there's people in the wider community that have larger spleens. But in this particular village or these particular people, they come from more than a village, they live on boats, but they're generally, most of them are born with larger spleens. So could that potentially be natural selection? Because they said they've been doing it for many generations. Could that have been natural selection? And so all the ones with the bigger spleens can still live in that sort of environment?
I think it could be. It's some sort of form of natural selection. And so it could be, people from the same family tend to have the same sort of traits, the same shaped noses, and you can tell somebody that comes from a particular family. And so these people might have originally started out, they were very good at swimming, and because they were exceptionally good at it, they spent a lot of time in the water, did a lot of diving, and so they acclimatized to it, became used to it, and it might have been something that just grew in the family. That's what you could call a speculation or a hypothesis as to how it could have developed. And that would be, equivalent to some sort of adaptation and selection, natural selection within families. People, families tend to go into careers which is similar to their parents, not always, but similar to their parents. And so this could have been some sort of similar sort of effect as that.
We often see how, mutations in DNA, that sort of thing, over the centuries and the generations, they're breaking down. They're not getting stronger and better. They're getting less and worse. In this particular case, with everybody being born with the largest spleens and not many really coming out with a normal size spleen anymore, is this a loss of information?
Well, it may not be. It all depends. I haven't done reading of the actual reports that this lady's published, but usually when there's something that occurs, like bacteria which get antibiotic resistance, that is often caused by breaking something, breaking the regulation of the way the cell has stuff come across the cell wall. So if you break something, and that actually can create antibiotic resistance, but the bacteria, because something's broken, it doesn't do as well. The same thing applies with malaria resistance, and you have this sickle cell anemia, which is a breaking of the genetics, which causes the blood cells not to form properly. And because of that, it has got an advantage in that they do not take on the malaria, infection, and people are protected from malaria. But because it's broken, what happens is that the person who's got this sickle cell anemia, actually, they are not as healthy as somebody without that mutation. So mutations tend to break things. And they, originally going back, 50 years, people who are biologists had great hope for mutations, that this is going to explain evolution. But really, I think with lots of experimentation, they've discovered that really it doesn't produce new things. Mutations break things and don't create things.
Wow. You are on 94.9. We're with Dr. Taz Walker from Creation Ministries International. If you have any questions, please send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. We're going to go into a little break now. We'll be back with Dr. Taz pretty soon. That was David Dunn with Spend a Life. You're on 94.9. It is 22 minutes to 5. And we have Dr. Taz Walker on the line from Creation Ministries International. He's happy to answer your questions. If you want to send them through to our text line, 0401 949 949. Dr. Taz, I noticed you had a story in creation.com on the website where you have thousands of stories. But one in particular, it says, only the Bible can explain the Ice Age. And I thought, okay, well, considering you wrote that, maybe you can explain to us, because quite often we hear on TV shows, they talk about this ice age that happened. They tend to get the dates a little wrong. Sometimes they tell us that it's just one of many ice ages. Can you clear it up for us? Was there one? Was there many? What's the go?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because for many years, like going back over 100 years, people didn't believe that there was an ice age because they believed that everything was always much the same as we see today. Although today, there is an ice age today. We're living in an ice age. There's glaciers in New Zealand, there's glaciers in the Rocky Mountains, there's glaciers in the Alps in Europe. So there's a lot of ice around the world, at the moment. But during the ice age, there was a lot more. A lot more of the land was covered, a lot more of North America was covered during the Ice Age. Mm-hmm. So when people finally sort of agreed, we agree, and didn't resist it, they basically said, but what caused it? How could you ever have more ice than you've got now? And they toyed with all sorts of ideas as to how it could happen. And one of the ideas was that maybe the sun was different brightness in the past and things were cooler, or maybe the moon was different, or maybe the earth was tilting differently, or something like that. They have all sorts of ways trying to explain it, and nothing really worked and explained it properly. And that's when you start with the biblical history as what the Bible says actually happened in the past, which is really helpful to know. What happened was there was Noah's flood, which the whole world was deluged and destroyed, and then the waters came off the landscapes, as the ocean basins sank and the continents went up. The water came off the land, and the oceans were much warmer immediately after the flood than they are today. Mm-hmm. And so that's the key. That is the key, is that the warm ocean means that lots more evaporation, which means lots more precipitation on the continents, lots more snow, lots more ice. And so that's what caused the ice to build up on the continents. It was not because the Earth was cooler, but it was because the oceans were warmer. And that's a really amazing explanation. And what happened was when the oceans eventually cooled, they were much warmer in the past than they weren't in equilibrium. But when they cooled, the evaporation went down and the ice melted back to basically what it is today. So that's the key. Only the Bible explains that, by when you take into account the global flood which occurred, and you can understand that it makes sense. And that causes a lot of, questions about climate models and what's causing the climate and global warming and all that sort of thing. That's all related to this issue of understanding the key of how the Bible explains the Ice Age.
And that's it's super interesting, the evaporation that you're talking about being so warm. I worked in the ski industry for years, and of course when we make snow, we could potentially make snow, in theory, up to +6 degrees. And the way they used to do it is by just pumping water through a jet. It was water, it wasn't frozen water or anything, but they used to blow lots of air into it, and it really high pressure air. The whole idea was a lot of that water that went through the jet would evaporate, and the evaporation around the remaining water would cause cooling and actually create snow. So, I understand that definitely evaporation causes cooling and snow. Very interesting.
Very interesting. Well, that's really a very practical, hands-on knowledge that you've got there. And it's different from, scientists sort of think about it and think about the natural way to do it would be just to cool the earth, but it doesn't work that way.
Wow, that's awesome. What about the number of ice ages?
Well, it comes from the way people look at the evidence and how they interpret it. And people, what we hear are people who believe that the world is millions of years old. They don't believe in Noah's flood, and so they've got a certain way of interpreting things. Now, when you start with the flood, you basically have one ice age, which occurred after the Noah's flood. You didn't have any during the flood, but it occurred after the flood. And basically, so what happened was, as the climate changed a little bit, you get slightly warmer periods, slightly cooler periods, you get the ice sheet sort of expands and contracts, all during that period after the flood, which lasted about 500 years. One estimate is about 500 years as the ice was building up. So you see this advance and retreat, which is just normal variation of climate, at the time. But the people who believe in long ages interpret that as being many ice ages over many hundreds of thousands of years. And so that's a totally different way of interpreting it. But there was only one ice age from a biblical flood, and it actually explains the evidence very, very well.
Yeah, wow. Now, I know in the Australian Alps there's a place called Blue Lake, and I've heard many people say that there used to be a glacier there. How can you tell that there would have been a glacier, that far north in Australia, a glacier? I mean, it seems unheard of today, but how do these guys know?
Well, there are certain evidences for glaciers. I don't know what evidence they've got for Blue Lake, but when you have a glacier, it's sort of a big layer of ice, thick ice. Could be 100 meters, couple of 100 meters thick, and it moves. It moves very slowly, and as it moves, the bottom of the glacier grinds the rocks and makes the stones, breaks the stones up into small pieces, which they call tillite, and it pushes these often to the side of the glaciers, and so you get these big mounds, which are called moraines. They run down the side of the glaciers, and as the glacier pushes down, it pushes all this tillite, all this broken rock in front of it, and it's called the terminal moraine. So if a glacier melts back, due to changes in climate, and it melts back, you can still see these moraines, which are the ones down the side and the one at the end. So, and you can see things like scratches on the rock. So that's another way that people interpret. But, these things are all, how would you put it? You have to be careful when you're interpreting the past, because sometimes you can jump to conclusions which are not quite correct. But that's sort of how they tell if there was a glacier in the area, from those sorts of evidences.
Yeah, wow. Wow, that's awesome. I mean, I've definitely seen lots of little rocks in that area. I've gone walking up to Blue Lake before, and you can sort of see how there's channels, I guess, carved out of the terrain where potentially, I guess, a big chunk of ice could have sort of slid down the hill. This is almost at the top of Mount Kosciuszko. You're very close to the highest peak in Australia. But
well, of course, that would have been glaciated then. You'd expect that because that's the highest part of Australia, and there's glaciers then.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dr. Taz, another awesome week.
Awesome week.
Very interesting. The whole ocean being warmer to create that evaporation, to create the ice age.
Yeah, it is amazing. It's sort of counterintuitive, isn't it? And there's a lot of things in life that are counterintuitive, and it's a very, very good one. And it would make a lot of difference to people who are worried about climate if they could understand those things and realize that the Earth's actually stable. It's not going to tip off the edge of a cliff, and it was created to be stable and to be able to have summer and winter and seed time and harvest as long as it remains. So that's cool.
Yep, it's all too perfect. Definitely a very, very, very smart designer created us, and I'm happy for it.
Yep, that's good. Well, good on you, Mick.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taz. Another awesome week, and we'll speak to you again later this year.
Yeah, that'll be nice. God bless you. God bless you, Mick.
You're on 94.9. It is 13 minutes to 5. We've got Francesca Battistelli up next, the breakup song.